The stars were quiet that night, too quiet. Jack Carter sat in the control seat of the small cargo vessel Nova Echo, eyes scanning the black void beyond the glass. Earth was just a blue memory behind him now. He had been flying solo for weeks, transporting raw fuel cores from Titan to a science base near the edge of explored space. A simple job. Routine. Safe. But routine didn't last long in deep space. Suddenly, the alarm screamed. Red lights flashed across the cockpit. The console buzzed with static. Jack slammed his hand on the override switch, trying to stabilize the ship. The engines were fine just seconds ago. Now they were spitting fire and rattling like loose bones in a tin can. He cursed under his breath and leaned forward. "Come on, girl, don't die on me now," he whispered. A sharp bang shook the vessel. Jack's body flew back into his seat, chest strapped tight, heart pounding louder than the alarms. He looked out the window and saw something. A second ship, spinning out of control, colliding with his. Its hull was scratched with alien markings, ones Jack had never seen in any database. They were going down. The crash was brutal. The ship twisted, screamed, and broke apart like paper in a storm. Flames licked through the side as metal bent inward. Jack was thrown against the wall, blood leaking from a gash above his eyebrow. Sparks flew. The sound of tearing steel filled his ears before everything went black. He didn't know how much time had passed when he opened his eyes. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. All he knew was that the ship wasn't flying anymore. It wasn't even whole. His body ached. His arm was bruised. But he was alive. He crawled out through a jagged hole in the wreckage. The air was heavy, thick with heat. Strange trees loomed in the distance, twisted things with glowing leaves and sharp branches that hissed when the wind passed through. The sky was purple. The ground was a dark, almost black moss that pulsed slightly under his feet, as if the planet itself was breathing. Jack pulled a small scanner from his belt. No signal, no life signs nearby, no known planet name. He was off the star charts. He was truly alone. Or so he thought. A soft whimper broke through the silence. Jack froze. He raised his metal rod, the only weapon he had pulled from the wreckage, and turned toward the sound. It came again, closer this time. It wasn't a beast. It sounded like a person. A voice, weak and broken. He stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. Then he saw her. Half buried under broken metal and wires was a female alien, breathing but unconscious. Her skin shimmered faintly like glass dipped in moonlight. Her long hair floated gently over her shoulders, silver blue like the ocean. She wore a dark suit torn at the shoulder, her arm bleeding. Jack didn't move at first. He had seen many aliens during his engineering work, some friendly, some not. This one, though, he didn't recognize. She wasn't from any species he knew. Her face was soft, almost human-like, but her eyes, when they opened slowly, glowing pale violet, were not like anything from Earth. She looked up at him in terror and immediately tried to crawl backward, groaning in pain. Jack raised both hands and dropped the metal rod. "It's okay," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand. She spoke something back, her voice high and sharp, her words filled with panic. It was a language he didn't recognize. Her tone told him everything. She thought he was the enemy. He didn't move. He just pointed to himself and said, "Jack, I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't reply. Her body was shaking. Her arm was bleeding more now. Jack looked around. They couldn't stay here. Night was coming fast, and he didn't like the way the jungle trees leaned in as the light faded. Jack grabbed a nearby panel from the ship wreckage and used it like a sled. He pulled it close to her and gestured gently for her to lie down. She stared at him, unsure. Then, slowly, she crawled onto the panel, wincing with every movement. He dragged her through the thick moss, away from the crash site, into a cluster of rock formations that looked stable enough for shelter. He found a dry spot under a rocky overhang and laid her down. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold. Jack opened his small medkit and did what he could. He didn't know her biology. He didn't even know if the medicine would work, but he cleaned the wound and wrapped it in cloth. She didn't stop him. When he looked into her eyes again, she was watching him, still scared, but a little less now. He lit a fire with parts of the engine core, careful not to trigger anything explosive. The warmth helped. She curled up near the flames and finally closed her eyes. Jack sat beside her, staring out at the alien night. The jungle glowed in patches. Far off, strange howls echoed like sirens. This wasn't a normal planet. Nothing about it felt right. Jack leaned back against the rock wall, eyes heavy with exhaustion. He didn't know what species she was. He didn't know where they were. He didn't know if rescue would ever come. But he did know one thing. They weren't alone out there. Something had caused the crash. Something had brought down not one, but two ships. And whatever it was, it might still be watching. The jungle never slept. Even when the sky turned black and the stars disappeared behind a thick purple mist, the strange alien trees kept whispering. Leaves curled inward and opened again like breathing lungs. Soft pulses of blue and green light flickered across their bark. The ground made quiet clicking sounds, almost like it was talking to itself. Jack didn't sleep much that night. He kept the fire alive and listened. Every time a branch snapped in the distance, his body tensed. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the unknown creatures moving through the darkness, or the idea that nothing might ever come to rescue him. By morning, the air had become warmer, almost heavy. Jack rubbed his sore neck and checked on the alien woman. She was still alive, still breathing slow. Her arm had stopped bleeding, but her face was pale. She opened her eyes for just a moment, looked at him, then passed out again. Jack sighed. He needed food, water, tools, and he had to find a way to protect them both before night came again. He left a marker made of engine panels near her resting spot and carefully made his way through the jungle. The trees groaned as he passed. Some of them moved slightly, their roots shifting across the ground like slow snakes. Insects the size of his hand crawled on glowing moss. He found a pool of water surrounded by giant stones with carvings, symbols that looked ancient, yet clean, as if they had just been written. He tested the water carefully with his scanner. No known bacteria. Still, he boiled it using a broken engine part and stored it in a metal canister. It was when he was filling the second one that he heard it. A growl. Low, deep, hungry. Jack turned slowly. Between two trees, in the distance, he saw yellow eyes staring at him. Not one pair. 3. He didn't run. He backed away, heart pounding. Whatever they were watching, testing. He returned to the camp as fast as he could, sweating and out of breath. The alien woman was awake now, sitting up, weak but alert. She flinched when she saw him, but didn't try to run. Her eyes followed his every move. Jack handed her the water. She looked at it with suspicion. He took a sip himself and then offered it again. This time, she accepted it. He watched her drink slowly, carefully. Then she looked at him, her voice soft and strange. Zelthun, Kramara. Jack shook his head. I don't understand. Sorry. She pointed to herself and said one word. Sira. Jack blinked. Sira, that's your name. She nodded. Okay, I'm Jack. He pointed to himself. Jack. Sira blinked slowly, then repeated, Jack. He smiled. Close enough. She tried to move her wounded arm, winced, and let out a sharp breath. Jack reached for her, but she pulled back. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, even though he knew she didn't understand the words. He pulled out the med kit again and showed her the cloth and gel. Then he pointed to her wound, then to the supplies. She hesitated, then nodded once, slowly. As he changed the bandage, she watched him. Her eyes weren't just scared anymore. They were curious. Jack wanted to talk, to ask what species she was, what ship she came from, why they had both crashed. But language stood between them like a wall. So he did the next best thing. He drew. He found a stick and began sketching shapes in the dirt. A rough picture of his ship, then another one crashing, then himself crawling out. Sira tilted her head, then pointed to his drawing. She picked up a smaller stick and drew her own ship, different in shape, sleeker, almost alive-looking. She drew a starburst, then showed both ships falling from the sky. Same moment, same event. She looked at him, eyes wide, and pointed up to the sky. She said something slowly. Materin. Vec Norai. Jack had no idea what it meant, but he felt the chill in her voice. The way she said it, like a warning. They weren't just unlucky. Something had brought them down, and if it could crash two ships from two different species at once, it was powerful, and possibly still here. The rest of the day passed with quiet work. Jack gathered metal panels from the wreckage to build a more stable shelter. Sira helped where she could, using strange hand motions to guide him toward certain parts of her own broken ship. Together, they built a canopy, a small wall of metal, and a place to store food and water. She showed him a small crystal from her ship, bright blue and pulsing gently. "Lorith," she said. Jack touched it. The energy made his skin tingle. He set it into a broken pipe and created a small torchlight, fixing it to the shelter wall. It glowed warm and steady through the night. They sat together near the fire again, silent. The bond between them had shifted. They weren't strangers anymore. Not quite friends, but no longer enemies either. Jack pulled out a damaged comms box. Sira leaned forward, examining it. He pointed to it. "Signal. Help." She nodded slowly, then tapped her own chest. "Lor Ithrex. Can't go home." He didn't understand the words, but her face said it all. She was stranded, too. They both were. When the Howls returned that night, closer than before, Jack stood and held the metal rod tightly. Sira reached for a piece of curved steel from the wreckage, forming it like a blade. They looked at each other. No more talking. No more guessing. Survival had no language. The sounds grew louder. Trees shook. Lights in the jungle pulsed. Something was moving, closer now. Watching. Studying. And as the wind shifted and the fire flickered low, Jack Carter knew one thing. They were not the only intelligent life on this planet. And tomorrow, they might have to fight for their lives. Jack woke up just before sunrise. The jungle was still dark, but the silence was even more dangerous than the noise. It wasn't natural. The soft clicks from the mossy ground had stopped. The glowing trees had dimmed. Even the wind had died. Something was wrong. He sat up slowly, reaching for his metal rod. Sira was already awake. She sat across from him, eyes wide, staring at the trees like she could feel something coming. She didn't say anything, just pointed to her ears, then the forest. Jack listened. No birds, no growls, no footsteps, only stillness. That kind of silence meant one thing: a predator was nearby, and everything else was hiding. He grabbed the torch they had made with her glowing crystal and stepped outside the metal shelter. The jungle looked the same, but it felt different. The air was heavy, sticky with something invisible. They didn't go far that day. Instead, they reinforced the shelter using parts from both ships. Sira knew her tech better than he ever could. She showed Jack how to activate a weak force bubble around the shelter. It didn't stop anything physical, but it messed with scanners and heat signals. Something like camouflage, a small piece of hope. By midday, the sounds returned, but they were different now. Voices, maybe. Echoes, but too smooth to be animals. Sira drew a shape in the dirt. A tall figure, thin and with long arms. Then she drew their crashed ships again. She connected them with a line, then pointed to the figure. Jack understood. Someone, something, had brought their ships down, and that someone might be watching them now. They needed to get higher ground. If they could see the area from above, they could find a better place to stay, or at least know what was coming. Sarah led Jack through a path she had scouted from her side of the wreckage. It was risky, but quiet. The trees were taller there, and one of them had strange ladder-like grooves carved into the bark. Not natural. Jack climbed first. His body ached with every step, but he didn't stop. Sarah followed slowly, keeping her injured arm close to her chest. At the top, the view almost made him forget everything. The planet stretched out in every direction, mountains with glowing rivers, thick purple forests, massive crater lakes that shimmered like glass. But what caught his eye was something else. About 5 kilometers west, half covered in vines and earth, was a structure, a building. It wasn't metal. It wasn't stone. It looked alive, grown, not built. Giant arches wrapped in plant roots, towers that bent with the wind. It didn't look abandoned. It looked asleep. Sarah saw it too. Her breath caught. She whispered something. Ankirith. He repeated the word. Ankirith. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him with fear, real fear. That word meant something ancient to her, maybe forbidden, maybe dangerous. But Jack didn't care. That structure might hold power, or tech, or a way to send a message off-world. He pointed to the building. We go. Sarah didn't argue, but her hands trembled slightly. They returned to camp and packed what they could. Food, water, the glowing crystal torch, and parts of the broken comms device. The journey took hours. The jungle grew thicker the closer they got. The plants began to change. Sharper edges, deeper colors, moving ever so slightly when they passed. At one point, Jack stopped. He saw something half buried in the ground. A helmet. Human. He picked it up. It was old, covered in moss and dried mud. Inside was a name tag. Lieutenant Carson Blake. Expedition 12150. Years ago. Jack's stomach dropped. They weren't the first to land here. Sarah saw the fear in his eyes and placed a hand on his arm. She said something soft, but it sounded like comfort. Jack nodded. He wasn't alone. Not really. Not anymore. They reached the edge of the structure by nightfall. It was massive. The walls pulsed gently like a heartbeat. A soft hum came from deep inside. The vines hanging down weren't just vines. They were cables, alien wires. The whole place was a living machine. They didn't enter yet. Jack wanted to rest and watch it first. They camped in the ruins of a small dome-shaped outpost nearby, likely once used by others. Inside, they found broken containers, some unreadable text, and most importantly, a dead signal booster. It was ancient, but it was human tech. He might be able to fix it. While Jack worked, Sarah wandered into a side room. Minutes passed before Jack noticed she hadn't come back. He stood, called out her name. Sarah. No answer. He grabbed his light and followed her tracks. Then he heard it, a low mechanical hum followed by a scream. He ran, turned a corner, and found her, trapped in a field of glowing blue vines. They were alive, wrapping around her legs and arms, slowly like snakes. She was panicking, trying to cut them with her metal blade. But every time she sliced one, 2 more took its place. Jack didn't think. He dropped the light and ran in, swinging the rod. He smashed the vines with all his strength. Electricity shot through him. The vines hissed and recoiled, slithering back into cracks in the wall. Sarah collapsed into his arms, gasping for breath. Jack pulled her away and sat her down. She was shaken, but okay. They looked at each other for a long time. He could feel it now. Whatever this planet was, whatever it once had been, it wasn't just dangerous. It was intelligent. The traps, the silence, the way things watched them but didn't attack until they stepped too close. Something here was learning, waiting. Jack held her hand as the night returned. They had shelter for now. But they were running out of time. And something in that alien building was awake again. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the alien structure. A soft mist hung in the air, drifting around the stone-like vines and pulsing walls. Jack stood at the edge of the entrance, staring into the massive archway that led deeper inside. Syrah was behind him, her steps slow but steady. Her wound was healing, but the fear in her eyes had not faded. They had camped in the ruined outpost through the night, taking turns sleeping and watching. Nothing had attacked, but something had watched. Jack felt it in the way the shadows moved, in the way the stone under their feet vibrated, as if something deep inside the earth was breathing again after centuries of sleep. He turned to her, searching her face. "You sure about this?" She didn't understand all of his words, but she looked at the doorway, then back at him, and nodded. They stepped into the unknown together. Inside, the walls were covered in smooth, glass-like panels. Some lit up as they walked past, reacting to movement or perhaps to body heat. Symbols floated across the surfaces like smoke, impossible to read, but hypnotic to watch. The temperature dropped the farther they went. Not cold like winter, but cold like old air trapped in a place where no living thing had been for a very long time. Jack kept his rod close, the makeshift weapon warm from his grip. Syrah walked beside him with her curved blade, scanning the halls with sharp, careful eyes. They passed through narrow passages and wide halls, each filled with strange machines and glowing roots. Some machines looked broken, others seemed aware. Their lights flickered when the humans got close, and some even followed their movement, like robotic eyes watching from the walls. They found a chamber with a dome-shaped ceiling. At the center stood a tall, thin pillar made of smooth white stone. It pulsed with soft blue light and let out a low hum that vibrated through their bones. Syrah stepped forward first. She placed her palm on the pillar. The moment she did, the light turned green, and the floor below them shifted. A hologram appeared. It was not a recording. It was a map, a full-scale 3D projection of the planet. Mountains, rivers, glowing forests. And over all of it, hundreds of small red dots, moving, shifting. Jack recognized what it meant before she said anything. They weren't alone on this planet. He pointed to one of the red dots moving slowly toward their current position. Enemy. Syrah looked at it, then at him. Her voice was quiet. Hunters. Jack's heart dropped. This wasn't just a crash site. This place was a hunting ground. Their ships didn't fail on accident. They were brought down, lured into the atmosphere like flies to light. For sport, or study, or something worse. Jack's fingers clenched into a fist. They needed to find a way off this planet. Fast. The hologram shifted again. It zoomed in on a tower far across the jungle, deep in a mountain range with sharp cliffs and storms circling above it. At the top of the tower, a beacon flashed slowly. A distress signal. Old, weak, but still running. Jack nodded toward it. There. We go there. Syrah seemed unsure, but after a moment, she nodded too. They turned to leave, but the hallway behind them was no longer empty. A figure stood at the edge of the light. Tall, thin, metal limbs and glowing red eyes. Its face was smooth, without a mouth. Its body was covered in armor that looked grown rather than built. It didn't move. Jack raised the rod, his heart pounding. Syrah stepped forward, her blade ready. The machine took one step, then another. Then it spoke. The voice came from all around them, not from the figure itself. It was deep, cold, and emotionless. You do not belong. Jack froze. The figure took another step. You are outside the parameters of the hunt. Return to the surface. Do not enter the core. Jack looked at Syrah. The core. She said nothing. Her face had gone pale. The machine didn't wait. It raised one long arm, and a glowing spear unfolded from its wrist. Jack didn't think. He charged forward, swinging his rod. It struck the machine's arm with a loud clang, but barely left a scratch. Syrah screamed and slashed from the side, slicing into a joint. Sparks flew. The machine swung the spear and hit Jack in the side. He fell hard, the wind knocked out of him. Syrah jumped between him and the machine, deflecting the next blow. The pillar behind them glowed brighter, and suddenly, a pulse of energy burst out in all directions. The machine froze. Lights around the room flickered. The walls groaned. Then the machine stepped back. The voice returned. "You have touched forbidden knowledge. You will be hunted." The figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Jack groaned, clutching his ribs. Syrah helped him up, her hands shaking. He coughed. "We made it mad." She didn't argue. The structure behind them began to dim. The lights faded. The humming stopped. Whatever had awakened was no longer curious. It was angry. They left the structure quickly, but Jack kept looking over his shoulder, expecting the machine to return. Back in the jungle, the mist had thickened. The ground felt warmer now. The sky above them swirled with strange colors, green and gold, and deep black clouds forming fast. Something had changed. They didn't speak for a long time. When they returned to their small shelter, the light from the crystal flickered, weak and fading. Syrah placed her hand on it, trying to calm it. It glowed brighter for a moment, then died completely. The jungle around them fell quiet again. That same silence. Only now, it wasn't the sound of a predator. It was the sound of a challenge. Jack sat against the wall, staring into the trees. Now he understood. They weren't just on a hostile planet. They were in a game. A twisted, ancient system designed to test, to break, to hunt. And the rules had changed. Because now they were not just prey. They had seen the core. And for the first time in centuries, something new had entered the game. Something human. The wind was no longer just wind. It whispered. It carried voices. Distant, hollow echoes that sometimes sounded like words, but always faded before they could be understood. Jack sat by the shelter wall, sharpening the edge of a metal plate, his ribs still sore from the fight inside the structure. Syrah sat across from him, silent, arms wrapped around her knees. Neither of them had slept much. The crystal that once powered their light was dead. The machines inside the alien building had gone quiet, and ever since the warning from the hunter drone, they had heard noises in the trees. Heavy footsteps, low pulses, clicks, and flashes of movement just out of sight. The jungle had changed again. It didn't just feel dangerous. It felt like it was waiting. Jack finished shaping the edge of the metal, turned it in his hands, then strapped it onto his arm like a shield. Every instinct inside him was telling him the same thing. They wouldn't survive much longer like this. They had to move. They had to reach that tower they saw on the map. That signal, that last chance. He turned to Syrah and pointed toward the mountains in the far distance. "We leave today," he said, voice firm. Syrah looked at him, hesitated, then nodded. She pulled her blade closer and stood. Her wound had mostly healed now, and though she still limped slightly, her eyes had regained their focus. They packed fast. Food rations, water, Jack's repaired comms box, and scraps of salvageable tech from the ship. Jack tucked the cracked display of the hologram map into his chest pocket. It didn't work anymore, but he had memorized the route. They moved out before the sun fully rose, keeping close to the thicker parts of the jungle for cover. The trees here seemed taller, more twisted. Some of them leaned over the path like arches. The light that passed through was strange, green and gold, and sometimes tinted red. The air smelled like burning wires. Twice, they passed what looked like fresh footprints. But they weren't animal, and they weren't human. They were long, three-toed, and heavy. The dirt was crushed deep. Jack crouched beside one of them, pressing his hand into the print. It was almost twice as wide as his palm. "Too close," he muttered. Syrah touched his shoulder, and pointed up a nearby cliff. Jack followed her finger and froze. At the top of the ridge stood a tall figure, covered in mud, metal armor strapped to his chest, one arm clearly cybernetic. A human man. He was watching them. For a moment, Jack thought it was a trick, a shadow, a memory. But then the man lifted a long rifle and pointed it toward the sky, not at them. A signal burst. A loud flare hissed into the air, crackling with blue sparks. Then the man vanished into the trees. Jack and Sarah stared at each other. Without speaking, they ran after him. The path was steep. Roots grabbed at their feet, and the mud made every step harder. But they didn't stop. At the top, the trees opened to a narrow clearing surrounded by stone spikes and bones. A camp. Primitive, but strong. Reinforced with ship panels, alien materials, and sharpened spears. And sitting in the center of it all was the same man. He didn't aim his weapon. He just watched them approach, face calm, unreadable. His beard was short, his eyes tired but sharp. Jack raised a hand. "We're not enemies." The man spoke for the first time, voice low and rough. Yet, Sarah stepped closer, her blade ready. The man looked at her and gave a small nod. You're not the first of your kind I've seen. But it's been years." Jack's eyes widened. "You've been here that long." The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood and walked to a metal panel on the ground. He lifted it, revealing a map scratched into the dirt. A rough layout of the region, cliffs, rivers, valleys, and a big red X drawn at the base of the mountain. "That tower?" Jack asked. The man nodded. "Signal station. Buried under centuries of jungle. Still flickers sometimes. I've been trying to reach it since the first year." Jack frowned. "Why haven't you?" The man looked up. "Because they don't let anyone leave." Jack swallowed hard. "The hunters." The man nodded again. "That's what we call them. Drones, machines, bioandroids. Doesn't matter. They patrol the region. They watch the structure you entered. They know when someone activates it." Sarah shifted, stepping forward. The man looked at her. "You woke something, didn't you?" Jack answered for her. "Yes. A drone. It spoke. It warned us. Then it tried to kill us." The man sighed. "Then the game has changed." Jack narrowed his eyes. "What game?" The man looked up at him, something dark and sad behind his expression. "This planet is a trap. A testing ground. Long ago, an alien race created it as a battlefield. They brought species here to study how they fight, how they adapt. Then they left. But the machines stayed, still running the simulations, still bringing ships down." Jack's heart sank. "You're saying this. This is all fake. Just a test." "Not fake," the man said. "Just forgotten. We're stuck in a lab no one's watching anymore. But the machines don't care. They'd follow the program." Jack paced. "There has to be a way to send a message." "There is," the man said. "That tower. But it's guarded. No one's made it that far in years." Jack looked at Sarah. She nodded, silently agreeing. Then Jack looked back at the man. "Will you help us?" The man hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached behind him and pulled out a small metal device, old, dusty, but humming faintly. "Take this. It's a power core from the old station. It should boost your signal when you get to the top." Jack blinked. "You're not coming." The man shook his head. "I've tried 5 times. Lost a lot of good people. I'll stay here and keep the drones distracted." Sarah looked uncertain. Jack felt the same, but they had no choice. The man stood and walked over to Jack, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've already made it farther than most, and you've done it together." He looked at Sarah. "That's rare on this planet." Then he walked back to his rifle and sat down again. Jack and Sarah didn't waste time. They left the camp with the power core, moving quickly toward the valley. The sun had shifted again. The jungle around them felt hotter. The vines moved more now. The trees leaned closer. And as they reached the edge of a narrow canyon, Jack saw something across the stone wall. Burning symbols. Fresh. The drones had marked their path. They knew where Jack and Syrah were going. And now, they were laying a trap. The canyon was narrow, sharp-edged, and filled with a silence that pressed against the skin like thick air. Jack moved slowly across the rocky ground, his boots crunching loose gravel beneath him. Beside him, Syrah stepped light-footed, her alien blade held low. The sky above them had turned dark gray, and small streaks of purple lightning danced between the clouds. The air smelled like metal and rain. They had been walking for over an hour since leaving the old soldiers' camp, the stolen power core wrapped in cloth and strapped to Jack's back. Every step brought them closer to the signal tower in the mountains, but every step also pulled them deeper into the hunter's territory. The markings on the stone walls glowed faintly as they moved, burning symbols that weren't there days ago. Fresh, angry, the machines weren't hiding anymore. Jack checked his scanner again. Still no signal. Still no map. Just static. Syrah tapped his shoulder and pointed ahead. The canyon split into two narrow paths. One turned upward toward a ridge of jagged stone teeth. The other dipped into a dark tunnel choked with vines and fog. Jack sighed. We don't know where either one goes. Syrah looked at both paths, then turned to Jack and spoke slowly, using the few shared words they had learned. Too many eyes. Together. One here. She pointed to herself. One there. Then she pointed to him. Jack shook his head. Split up. That's risky. She repeated softly. Together. Too loud. He hesitated, thinking. She was right. They had been noticed. The drones would expect them to move together. Two targets meant more chance of detection. Separating now might confuse the machines. Buy them time. He looked into her eyes, searching for doubt. There was none. He nodded. Jack handed her one of the signal flares from the old man's camp. If you run into trouble, shoot this. Syrah held it gently, nodded, and then turned toward the tunnel. Jack took the high path, climbing over the stone ridge. Each rock edge sliced the soles of his boots, but he kept going higher, watching the mist below. He could barely see her anymore. She had already vanished into the vines. The wind screamed through the rocks like voices. Every few minutes, Jack stopped and listened. The jungle in the distance seemed far away now. He was entering the mountain's body. Harder, colder, lonelier. After 30 minutes of climbing, he found a ledge that opened into a wide platform. From here, he could see the tower, tall, dark, broken at the top, but still standing. A single red light blinked like a heartbeat, faint, dying. He sat to rest, watching the road ahead. But then, something moved. A shadow. Not a drone. A person. Jack stood slowly, raising his rod. Syrah. No answer. The figure walked toward him from the left side. Tall, slim, with armor plating, but no weapons in hand. Jack stepped back. Then the figure spoke. Not with sound, but with a soft echo inside his mind. You are not part of the design. Jack froze. The figure came closer. It wasn't human, and it wasn't machine. It was something in between. Flesh under armor. Eyes that glowed gold instead of red. Jack gritted his teeth. You're one of them. The voice in his mind returned. I am what came before. I watched your kind enter the game. I watched you break the rules. Jack tightened his grip on the rod. We didn't choose this. You crashed our ships. No, said the voice. You were chosen, not as prey, but as proof. Jack's heart pounded. Proof of what? The creature stepped closer. That connection still exists, even among different stars. Jack shook his head. I don't understand. You will. Then the figure vanished, like smoke blown away by wind. Jack stood there, stunned. Sweat rolled down his back. His mind ached. He didn't have time to think. Because in the valley below, a red light shot into the sky. Cyrus flare. She was in danger. Jack ran. He slid down the rocks, bruising his knees and scraping his hands. He hit the bottom hard and sprinted toward the tunnel, heart racing, lungs burning. The closer he got, the more he heard metal slicing air, electric crackling, and a sharp cry. He reached the entrance just as a massive drone stepped out, dragging Sira by her arm. She was bleeding, her blade gone, her hands tied in glowing blue bands. Jack didn't hesitate. He swung the rod with both hands, striking the drone in the back. It barely flinched, but it dropped her. Sira fell to the ground, gasping. The drone turned. Its face lit up red. It lunged. Jack ducked, rolled, and slammed the rod against its head again. Still not enough. Sira, from the ground, pulled something from her belt, a small round device. She smashed it against the drone's leg. The explosion was small, but strong enough to knock the drone back. Sira screamed, "Go!" Jack grabbed her hand and pulled her to her feet. They ran, slipping through vines, past fallen stone, deeper into the mountain pass. Behind them, the drone stood again, limping now, damaged but not destroyed. They didn't stop until they reached a small crevice in the rock wall. Jack pulled her inside. The space was tight, dark, and smelled of wet moss. Sira leaned against him, weak, blood on her shoulder and lip. He looked at her wounds, eyes wide. "You okay?" She nodded slowly, chest rising and falling. Jack reached into his pouch and pulled out a med strip, pressing it to her side. She winced but didn't speak. They sat in silence, listening to the drone's steps fade away. And then Sira spoke, softly, broken words. "I was not sent here by mistake." Jack turned. She met his eyes, pain and truth mixing in her voice. "My people knew this planet. Long ago, we warned others. No one believed." Jack stared at her. "You knew it was a trap." She nodded, ashamed. "I tried to stop them. They sent me anyway. To see, to prove." Jack leaned back, the weight of her words crashing over him. All this time, he thought they were just two strangers trapped by chance. But Sira, she had known more. Maybe not everything, but enough. He didn't say anything. Not yet. She reached for his hand, weak fingers wrapping around his. "I did not want this. I only wanted to help." Jack didn't pull away, because he knew something else now too. They weren't just running from death anymore. They were running toward a secret that had been buried for generations. And soon, they would reach the tower. But they wouldn't be the only ones waiting there. The rain came in sheets, heavy and cold, soaking Jack's clothes and turning the mountain path into slippery stone. The wind howled like a living thing, pushing against them with every step. But still, they climbed. Sira limped beside him, weak but moving. Her wounds were wrapped now, and her eyes burned with quiet fire. Jack carried the power core strapped tightly against his back. They were only half a kilometer from the tower now. Each step forward felt like walking into the mouth of a storm. The sky above raged, filled with violet lightning and dark clouds spinning like a cyclone. But through it all, one thing remained steady, the red blinking light at the top of the tower, calling them forward like a heartbeat from another world. The mountain curved into a narrow path, lined by fallen statues and broken metal spires. It was clear now. This place had once been a facility. Not just a signal post, but part of something larger, something ancient. They reached a wide stone platform near the tower's base. The tower loomed above them, twisted but strong, made of metal and glass grown from the mountain itself. Machines buzzed quietly beneath the stone. Blue vines pulsed along the ground. And ahead of them, blocking the entrance to the stairwell, stood 2 hunter drones. Jack froze. They hadn't seen them yet. He looked at Sira, who was breathing hard, her blade still in her grip, Her body trembled, but her gaze didn't waver. "We can't fight both," Jack whispered. She looked at the spires around them, then pointed. A broken column leaned against the left side of the platform, half buried in dirt and moss. If it fell, if it landed right, it could crush one of the drones. Jack didn't wait. He moved fast, crawling toward the base of the column. His fingers slipped on the wet surface, but he managed to wedge a shard of metal underneath the leaning stone. He pushed. Nothing. He pushed harder. The stone creaked. One drone turned. Jack gritted his teeth and shouted, slamming the rod against the base. The stone groaned and fell. The crash was thunder. The column smashed into the drone's side, pinning it to the ground. Sparks flew. The second drone turned and activated its weapon. Syrah was already moving. She sprinted forward and threw her blade. It struck the drone's arm just before it fired. The energy burst hit the ground, sending up steam and dirt. Jack ran. He slammed into the drone with his shoulder, knocking it back. The weapon clattered to the ground. Syrah picked it up. For a moment, time froze, her hand on the strange alien rifle, her finger over the trigger. The weapon adjusted itself to her touch, recognizing her, her blood, her heritage. She fired. A single white beam struck the drone through its chest. It fell, silent. Jack collapsed beside her, gasping for breath. They had made it. Together, they stepped into the tower. Inside, the air was dry, stale. The walls hummed with energy, old but alive. Jack found the control panel in the center of the room, a disk surrounded by faded symbols and dusty glass screens. He placed the power core into the socket. The tower lit up. Red lights turned green. The floor vibrated. A soft hum grew louder. The signal was activating. He touched the screen and entered the emergency code from his ship. Then again, and again. The screen flickered. Transmission accepted. Signal boosted. A soft voice echoed from the walls. Message sent. Jack fell to his knees. He had done it. After everything, the message had gone out. Now, all they had to do was wait. But something wasn't right. Syrah was standing by the wall, her hands pressed against a glowing panel. Her body was stiff, her eyes wide. Jack stood and walked over. "Syrah." She looked at him, and he saw tears in her eyes. "This place is more than signal," she said. She turned the panel toward him. It displayed hundreds of names, not in human language, but in symbols, alien names, long lists. Syrah touched one, and it translated. Subject, Syrah Lorraine. Status, Royal Line confirmed. Experimental key. Access level. Core Guardian. Jack blinked. "What does that mean?" Syrah didn't answer. Because the tower began to shake. Outside, the storm thickened. Lightning struck the ground in waves, and deep below them, something awakened. The voice returned, not from a speaker, not from the room, from the planet itself. Core protocol activated. Last Guardian detected. New sequence. Reset. Jack turned to Syrah, panic rising. "What's going on?" She held his hand gently. This world, it was not just a test ground. It was a prison. For machines, for failed weapons, for monsters. She looked out the window. And only someone like me could end it. Jack stepped back. End it how? Syrah touched the floor. The tower answered. A countdown began. Core explosion will begin in 10 minutes. Jack shook his head. "No, you'll die." She smiled. "I was sent here to die. But now, I choose how." Tears ran down Jack's cheeks. "You don't have to." "I do," she said. "If this place stays, more will come. More will suffer. You can leave. The signal has opened a door, but you must go now." He couldn't speak. He wanted to argue, to scream. But her eyes were calm. He stepped forward and held her tightly. "I'll come back," he whispered. Sarah smiled. "You won't need to. I'll be in every star you look at." She pressed her hand to the control panel. A bright light filled the tower. The signal beamed into the sky, so bright it cut through the storm. And outside the planet's orbit, a ship received it. Days later, Jack woke up on a rescue ship, surrounded by doctors and soldiers. His body was weak, but alive. He asked about the planet. They said it collapsed in on itself, gone, reduced to dust. No signs of life. No survivors. But when Jack looked out the ship's window at the stars, he saw one small sparkle, blue and silver, like Sarah's eyes. And he smiled, because even if no one else believed it, he knew she had saved not just him, but the galaxy itself, and her name would live on in every world he touched, forever.